Hello, and welcome to a special interview with The Wheel to conclude our series on the female diaconate, deaconesses. People talk all sorts of ways. And we're very, very lucky to be joined today by Carrie Frederick Frost. She is the chair of the St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess and a well-regarded scholar of modern Orthodox Christianity who teaches at Western Washington University and Holy Cross Seminary. Thank you so much. You are also set to appear in the upcoming documentary from Ancient Faith. And Carrie's book, Church of Our Granddaughters from Cascade Press, is incredible. There will be a link to buy that in the description box. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Katie. It's great to see you. It's great to be here. I'm excited to talk.
I know it's always a pleasure to talk to you. So there's the added benefit that this feels kind of worky. So I get to chat with you in a way that feels vaguely worky. So thank you. Just to start, do you want to just tell us a little bit about the history and work of the St. Phoebe Center, and we can kind of go from there.
Sure. So the St. Phoebe Center was founded 11 years ago now by a group of people that wished to see deaconesses in the Orthodox Church again today. And so it's a U.S. nonprofit. The mission is to educate and advocate for deaconesses in the Orthodox Church. I took over the chairship about a year ago now, and we spent the first decade of our work thinking about educating about the history for deaconesses, the need for deaconesses in the church today. And now we are thinking about our second decade being about how to have deaconesses in the church today to really help the church imagine and enact this much needed order.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I think obviously your work at St. Phoebe Center in some ways is very connected to Church of Our Granddaughters and to what you sort of write about there. And it is, I think, probably the most kind of thorough meditation on what the role of women in the Orthodox Church will look like going forward. So you sort of talk about that, and I'm always interested to hear what sort of inspired you to sit down and write this. Obviously, you're doing work along these lines, but really to write something so comprehensive and largely directed, I think, at a non-specialist audience.
Right. Yes. So, I really wrote this book because I love the church. I grew up in the church like you did. This is our ancestral faith, and I want it to have a future. And through my work, through my scholarship, and also just personal experience, learned over time that the church falls short when it comes to women. That we have this lovely theological anthropology about men and women as equal in the incarnation, equal in salvation, but we don't always live that out. That's not always our experience. So we're out of sync, and that's really what this whole book is about, is ways in which the church is out of sync on this issue of women. Each chapter looks at a particular issue and talks about the history of that issue. Like, for example, menstruation is one of the chapters. What's happening today, what's being taught today, and what might happen in the future in the Church of Our Granddaughters. So there's this pattern throughout the chapters with the real hope that future generations will experience this sort of change. And like you said, it was important to me to write it for a non-specialist audience. This is not an academic book, strictly speaking. I wanted this to be something that pretty much anyone who has some sort of interest in women in the church could pick up and manage.
So, and I think, and I don't think this was on the sort of when we talked before, but, I think one of the sort of overriding troubles that the church is experiencing with respect to women is the disconnect between the lives women lead in Western societies today, where for the most part they are treated as equal and have the same opportunities as men, and the experience they have at church. And I think that's increasingly challenging for young women who maybe didn't have didn't have the yayas and babushkas in the corner like we did, being like, this is what we gotta do, sorry. Like whose grandmothers and mothers have had different experiences as well. I don't know if you'd like to speak to that at all.
Well, sure. I certainly do think that's true. And I hear that a lot from younger women, that when they're, out in the world, they feel valued for the skills that they have and the education that they have and what they have to offer. They're often paid for the skills they have and what they have to offer out in the world, and appreciated, and are able to be, like you said, in positions of leadership and so forth. And then they come to church and they don't feel that. So there's this real disparity in experience for them. And men notice this too. This is not just women experience it, but there are certainly men that notice it. And I think that's an interesting thing, because what has happened is that societal change has driven churches and other religious institutions as well to really think, well, what should we be like inside of our church? Should we match these kind of secular societal values? What does our own tradition teach us? How should we reconcile these things? And for me, what's so interesting about Orthodox theology is, like I said when we started, we have this theological anthropology. So it's a matter of enacting it. It's not a matter of, capitulating to secular norms or something like that. The secular situation pushes us to ask questions, I think, and brings those questions to mind in a new way. But our answers are actually internal answers.
I think that's a really important point. I think that one of the criticisms of work like this and thinking like this is it's just the church adapting or responding to, bad developments in the secular world, and the church sort of acclimating to the culture in not a positive way. And I think, one of the things I think you're very careful about in Church of Our Granddaughters is to avoid that. But do you want to speak to that sort of criticism in any way?
Well, I think what's interesting is the flip side of that criticism is people who are worried about societal change, worried about the pace of change around us, which I can sympathize with that to some degree. They often feel like the church shouldn't make any change in reaction to the quick change around us. So there's a capitulation there, right? There's this, being influenced by the secular world there of like, oh, we shouldn't change anything. To me, I don't think we should value stasis for the sake of stasis. I think we should, right? What's true and what's good and what's right based on our tradition. Whether those questions are coming from inside or outside, we need to answer them from inside. Yeah,
no, I think that's important, and I think, the reality is the church has always responded to what is happening in the world, and you can't. And Orthodox aren't Amish, right? Like that's not we're not trying to do that either. And I think that's an important point. And I don't know if we've discussed this before, so if it's unfair, I can give you some more time, certainly. But one of the things that's been very challenging for me, I'll just be honest, as I've heard these arguments develop, is I frequently worry the arguments being made in favor of deaconesses, and in greater liturgical participation for women generally, tend to either dismiss or undervalue what has been the traditional contributions of women as catechists, as spiritual leaders and spiritual models. And that does really trouble that troubles me, who, in sort of general terms is supportive of these reforms. And I wonder if you could speak to that, if you could speak to the prevalence of those arguments. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, because I have many complicated thoughts, and you seem to have it more together.
I have some complicated thoughts too. I agree with you. That would trouble me as well, because the fact of the matter is, Orthodox Christian women have always participated in the life of the church in lots of different ways that have changed and morphed over time. But we have been essential to the church. I think it's honestly safe to say the church might not be around if it had not be for women and our participation and our piety. And, all the numbers support this, right? Like all the Pew numbers about religious participation, it's women that go and are part of their traditions. So I think, to me, we have to keep that in mind. And it's so important to me that, yes, we have all sorts of spaces for women to contribute to the church, as they have been doing, as they might do in the future. I always think of, and I talk about this in the book, the ladies of my hometown parish in West Virginia, and how this was just the sweetest bunch of people, and they cooked and they cleaned. And, I know some people, especially sort of in response to feminism, might be like, we don't want to do that anymore. That was the only role we had for so long. We can't do that anymore. But those are good things. Like, it's a really great thing to have people come to church and tidy it up and feed, my hungry self as a child afterwards. So I want to value all those things. I think that's a really important thing to take forward in our discussion as we think about change around women in the church.
Absolutely. No, and I would think about, there's this anecdote about Stalin, right? Who, as he's talking about how are they going to suppress the church, and he goes, okay, bishops will capitulate, priests, a few of them might cause trouble, but there's gulags, but you can't arrest every pious grandmother. And I would hope, and I that does make me uncomfortable when it comes up in the conversation, the way it's, that liturgical participant, that active, standing in front, because everyone's participating in the liturgy, but standing in front during the liturgy, having the speaking role is the sole or is the superior measure of
Good. Yeah, the higher good. I agree. And the other thing to add there too is that, what I would like to see with deaconesses in the church, and I share this with others at the St. Phoebe Center, is not just a liturgical role, because of course that's what we've done to deacons, is we've reduced the role to like a liturgical helper, but instead the fullness of this order of diaconia, of service, of pastoral care, of all those sorts of things, of woman-to-woman ministry. So to me, that's really the heart, actually, of the diaconate, is that kind of service ethos. And so thinking about that and developing that for the future is also a way, I think, to avoid diminishing other roles that women have had. And
I think, the extension of that is the sort of clericalism that is, and in what ways is this a response to sort of clericalism in our churches, in our cultures? Because I think a lot of this is about clericalism in Balkan and Eastern European culture. That is a very real, the priest is kind of magical, right? And I think what some people hear is, why can't women be magic, essentially? So yeah, I think that, these are in constructing these debates, like I said, when I hear from you, like in constructing these debates, I mean, how do you sort of avoid those pitfalls? I know that's a huge question, but it sounds like you're very conscious of it, certainly. I think there are maybe less careful voices, but you're certainly very conscious of that. And I'd like to hear more about that.
Right. Well, I think connecting not just deaconesses, but connecting deacons as well, connecting men and women in this order, and this idea that we could experience a revival of this entire order. I think that would really work against clericalism, because first of all, it would give us kind of a balance back to the major orders. We would have more deacons and deaconesses than we do priests, than we do bishops, whereas now like a deacon's kind of a rare bird for a lot of us. We don't see deacons all that often. I think like sort of numbers and quantity would mean that we would switch to a more service ethos that is less clerical. And the diaconate has traditionally been the bridge kind of between the major clergy and the rest of the people, and had this place of like interaction, and we've taken that away. So we've created a big distance between the priesthood and the rest of the people. So I think it would be a, non-clericalizing move to have a fuller diaconate today.
Well, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think there's these sort of added layers that are more than just like, what are girls allowed to do, certainly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As readers engage with Church of Our Granddaughters, what takeaways or reflections do you hope they gain from these stories? Because I think, one thing that this conversation is getting to is that so much of this is bound up in people's personal experiences, their grandmothers and granddaughters, the weird priests they had when they were a teenager. All of that is sort of bubbles to the surface, particularly for those of us who are from Orthodox backgrounds, right? Where there's nowhere else to turn.
Right. Well, yes. And that's one reason I do include several kind of anecdotes, personal anecdotes, either from myself or some people that I know who gave me their permission to include them, because that kind of women's experience hasn't always been shared, hasn't always had venues to be shared in the church. And so I think it's really important that we listen to those experiences, that we value them. So that was one reason to bring them into the book. And one of the reactions to the book is I have received so much personal correspondence from women in the church sharing their experience. So it has certainly prompted, maybe even to a degree that has surprised me, this like wanting to share this personal experience and wanting to have a place where one can do that we feel validated and safe, and good to do that. And so I feel like it's carved a little space for that, which to me is very, very gratifying, that it might open up places to have these conversations.
Well, I think it points to the hunger for these conversations and the difficulty of them. And along the lines of that difficulty, I was not your first choice of interviewer. I'm not hurt by that. I'm saddened, but I'm not hurt.
If you asked first, yeah.
I'm not saddened. I'm, I get over it. I get over it. But you were scheduled to have an interview with Ancient Faith Ministries, formerly Ancient Faith Radio, if you've been around a long time and default to that. And I believe you recorded that interview. Oh no, it was not even recorded. Okay. But that was scratched by not the podcaster, but by someone higher up. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that, not as a sort of, what Ancient Faith did wrong, but, in the ways that it highlights how difficult these conversations are and the ways that different voices are being silenced.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you a few of the details too, because I think they're relevant to that kind of conversation. I was scheduled last fall to be on a show, Everyday Orthodox, like a live interview show, talking about my life as an Orthodox Christian, which of course includes my work on women in the church and my book and so forth. And then just a few days before the show was scheduled to air and for me to be interviewed, AFR canceled it. Ancient Faith just canceled it out of pocket. And this was after being reassured on a previous occasion that Ancient Faith allows their creators to dictate content. So they allow their podcasters to decide who to have on and what to talk about, short of heresy. Like I had previously been told that. So then Ancient Faith portrayed the cancellation as if it were a mutual decision, which it was not. It was a unilateral decision. And I was displeased with that. I was displeased with some sort of association with heresy, and also displeased with a dishonest portrayal of why the show was canceled. And I asked for corrections on both those items, but I'm still waiting. I'm yet to receive those. So what's happened since then, and then I'll comment about where I think what this has to say about the conversation, is I was invited to be interviewed for an Ancient Faith documentary, which will air later this month. I was interviewed, other people were interviewed, and the idea, I am told, is to present different views on deaconesses in the church. I reluctantly agreed to do this because there's no good faith, between Ancient Faith and myself at this point, but I felt like it was right to do because I am the chair of the St. Phoebe Center, and because I believe, what I have to say is in good faith and is ultimately right and true. And, we should be able to say those things, even if they're in a hostile environment. So we'll see what happens with that. Of course, I have no editorial control or, say. We'll see what happens. But what this has is it really brought home to me, obviously in a very personal way, the ability in certain parts of the church to shut down conversation, and the control over conversation, the control of like an issue of what is really of intellectual freedom. And any healthy community should be able to talk about anything. We should be able to talk about anything. We don't have to agree on everything, but we should be able to talk about anything. And so the idea to me that my work, which I think is actually very sort of modest proposal in the grand scheme of things, that my work would not be okay to talk about, is really kind of frightening. I don't need people to agree with me. I don't need people to like me or agree with me. But the idea that it's somehow taboo is a very, very depressing and dark idea.
Yeah. No, and I think this is, what was sort of shocking. And I don't know if it's been clear. Like I have questions about, deaconesses, and, I think what's been sort of shocking to me is how strongly, maybe that's the moderate word, how strongly certain voices have been in trying to just shut the conversation down. And especially a platform like Ancient Faith, which is, for better or worse, very mainstream.
Of course,
right? And that they don't want to have this conversation, which I think is, I've read your book. There is no heresy I detected in it. It's actually pretty moderate. I can see critiques that it doesn't go far enough, right? So I think that that's really problematic. And you mentioned the question of intellectual freedom. There's an upcoming Wheel issue on intellectual freedom. There will be a link to buy that and subscribe to the Wheel in the comment box. But also, I think this is a problem throughout the Orthodox world, and it's distressing to me that in North America and Western Europe, where frankly so many of our ancestors came because of the repression they experienced in their homelands, that even that here in some ways we are not just censoring ourselves more, censoring ourselves as much as in those homelands, but even more in some ways. I think about the OCA's encyclical last summer. The Church of Greece has been, certainly antagonistic to the government's proposals about same-sex marriage in Greece, but they have allowed the conversation. They haven't said, if you participate in this, you're done. And what I see with ancient faith, and maybe you could comment on this, what's very distressing to me is this tradition that has so much experience with repression and with the censoring of voices from outside the church, from within the church and from outside of it, that we are replicating those patterns. And that's about more than deaconesses, right? I mean, that's a much bigger issue. I don't know if you want to speak to that sort of connection.
Well, I think you're wise to connect it, because I think it is that big of a problem. One of my cousins in Belarus was a dissident. He was a priest. He was a political dissident. And he was thrown in jail several times for what he had to say, both about the government and the church. And so it's very personal to me, right, that this happens. That it happens not in this super far past, but in the last 20, 30 years for him. And we, to me, the gospel is a gospel of liberation. It's a gospel of freedom. And so if we're living that out, like I said, we should be able to talk about anything. We should be able to talk about anything. I don't know why we'd be afraid to have these conversations. They can be difficult to have, we don't have to disagree. But I think that is something we just really need to work on as a community, is being faithful, being true to ourselves, and having this kind of freedom to talk about things.
Absolutely. And I think the deaconess conversation has the emotions it's excited are frequently not just about deaconesses, right? In many of the responses to your work, for example, I hear people who are talking about things that are not what you were talking about. I think they are about responses to fear in the wider culture, and about change in the wider culture and what they perceive as happening in the wider culture, rightly and wrongly. Once again, like you, I'm sympathetic to I'm the obedient eldest daughter of an ethnic family. I'm not not on the way to radicalism, but I think that it's dangerous to allow those fears about the wider culture into what are good faith conversations about the church. And I wonder if you in your work personally, or the St. Phoebe Center, like, how do you sort of address those? Have you thought about that? Like, how can you obviously you can't be the sole good faith actors in these things, but how do you respond to what are oftentimes bad faith responses, if I'm being honest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I mean, I have a personal answer to that question. I also have a St. Phoebe Center answer to that question, I suppose. Personally, I don't respond, personally, I'm not on social media, so I don't see a lot of what happens out there, which is great. Sometimes people say things, but I don't know. And especially people that are going to really, like you said, kind of misrepresent my work, like bring in other things that I'm talking about deaconesses, I'm talking about X, and then 25 other things are somehow construed into the conversation. That's not really worthy of the dignity of a response. I'm happy to engage with people that disagree with me or want to know more or skeptical or whatever. But that kind of abuse and misrepresentation of my work, I'm not going to respond to that, in any way. The St. Phoebe Center, actually, I said I was going to say represent each, myself and the St. Phoebe Center, but in many ways has been the same way. We have not been a reactive organization. We have received criticism. Some of it has been public, some of it has been vitriolic. But we just have the attitude that we don't need to respond to all those things. And in fact, what we need to do is just keep doing our good work, knowing that there will constantly be misrepresentations of it and opposition and so forth. And that's just part of it, right? It's just, that's not going to go away. There's nothing I could say, or the St. Phoebe Center could say to change those people's minds or fix anything. So to just kind of keep on keeping on with what we have to say. Yeah.
That is at the very least very brave. So thank you so much. Just to conclude, what are your wishes for the church of your granddaughters and for when in sort of my other life when we do oral histories, we always say, what if which this is probably good for this one too. What if your granddaughter discovers this interview 40 years from now, and the internet's been broken, so she finds some weird like Wayback Machine, and she hears this. What kind of church do you hope she's living in? And what do you hope she hears coming from you?
Right. That's such a sweet question. I would hope for the church of our granddaughters and grandsons too. I use the term granddaughters in the title because the book is about women, and that makes sense. But this is just as much a hope for everyone in the future of the church as it is for granddaughters. I would hope that women would be, truly appreciated as fully human. I mean, that sounds so simple, but that isn't always the case. I would hope that there would be some ritual change and I address this in the book, some change to the miscarriage prayers, some change to the churching prayers that honors the maternal body. I would hope that women would be in new positions of leadership, and leadership's kind of a general term, but for example, contributing to conciliar and synodal processes, that sort of thing. And I would hope that there would be deaconesses in the church. And by the time of my granddaughter, as I write in lots of places, I see the real need for this. I see the real lack of woman-to-woman ministry in the church, of church-sanctioned, church-ordained woman-to-woman ministry. And I see the church kind of suffering from the lack of a feminine expression of these things, men and women. And so I would hope that my granddaughters would experience all of those things and feel fully welcome and fully affirmed for who they are as women.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for no heresy. Shocking. I was prepared to edit it out, but there you managed to get through the whole 30 minutes without it. So Carrie Frederick Frost, we're going to link to the book, Church of Our Granddaughters. We'll link to the St. Phoebe Center and follow everything she does. It's really brilliant work. And even if you don't want deaconesses or you think they will ruin the church, engage with the work in good faith, because there's a conversation to be had here. And that, in terms of our community, is probably the most important thing. So thank you so much. And
Good to talk to you,
come
Katie.
back
Yeah.
to us. Okay.
Good.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.